All right, we're back on Capitol Hill for the first time since early May, and once again we've been invited up here by Representative Elaine Luria. The other dimension in this visit is we're going to attend the final J6 Select Committee hearing, which should be interesting, to put it mildly. But as you might imagine, cameras are not allowed in the hearing room unless you're a member of the credentialed media, which I am not. So we'll continue this episode in her office after the hearing is done. So we'll see you guys then. Thank you for inviting us back. Last time we were here was in early May. It seems like just yesterday, but a lot has happened.
A lot has happened
since then, to put it mildly. As we sit here now, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023 was passed by the Senate after being passed by the House.
Passed by the House in July.
And it contains 11 what we call battle force ships.
This is the largest investment we've seen in shipbuilding in a single year. We upped the number of destroyers, DDGs, from essentially 2 a year. Or actually, the Navy really wanted less. They said 9 plus 1 with an option, sort of an incentive over the next 10 years. And we upped it to 15. There have been mixed messages to the industry. How many do you want them to build? And you keep saying, well, they can't quite get to 3 a year between the 2 yards. But if you don't order 3 a year, why are they going to make that investment to do that? So I think we're trying to send a very clear signal from Congress to say we want to build more. We set a floor for the number of amphibious ships because there were attempts to decommission several of those platforms. We essentially saved the Vicksburg from decommissioning after huge investments have made, the Gettysburg, the Vicksburg, some of the cruisers that are at the tail end of their modernization process. And does it do everything I want it to do? No, but it's significant improvement. The product, once we took it in, the House, the Senate, we added more. I mean, it's getting better. The investments that we've made in the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and other key investments in the region are very important. But it's a continuing push. I mean, I think that we need to continue to make this a priority, and this budget is a step in that direction, largest defense budget ever. But I still have that problem of, if our number one threat is China and our number one concern is the Pacific, it's a maritime theater, so the Navy, the Air Force, they need a preponderance of the resources, and we're still kind of stuck in this, one-third, one-third, one-third paradigm. And when are we going to have that serious discussion about what is the role of the Army in this theater? And
so when are we going to have that conversation?
I think this budget this year sends a clear signal. I mean, we are prioritizing the maritime, the air assets that are most important in the Pacific theater, but it's going to need to continue, and I think even more of a shift needs to happen.
As I mentioned, it's been about 7 months since we last spoke. What has happened with the China threat in that time? Is it getting worse? Are we mitigating it?
The level of concern about the time frame or the immediacy doesn't get translated from the combatant commander, the Pacific Fleet commander, through the White House, National Security Council. So we're over here in Congress saying, this is urgent. Here's this Davidson window. We really need to look at the 7-year time frame. That's now 6 years since that testimony happened in the Senate. The military, the operational side, the combatant commander, the fleet commander, everyone actually in the Pacific is saying, here's a sense of urgency over here. We need to do more. We need to do it more quickly. But, that translation through a defense budget to come to us in Congress, it gets lost. That sense of urgency, that fact that, we're looking at a 5-year window where we need to do what needs to be done in a time of, contingency with what we have today. And this divest to invest, this idea we're going to divest of things today to save money and reinvest it in a capability that isn't fully developed yet, that we might build 20 years from now. We don't have that luxury of time. So that, I think, is a consistent thread that remains the same from when we last spoke.
So are you speaking when the leadership comes from the front to testify, there's not enough urgency? They're sort of soft selling the threat, or
I think from
what's
the
frustrating
commander perspective, there is a sense of urgency. I mean, I hear Admiral Aquilino, Admiral Davidson before him, they adequately and accurately convey the sense of urgency that's necessary. That's where this testimony, when Admiral Davidson was departing, he said, and Admiral Aquilino echoed him, within the next 6 years, we anticipate that China could try to take Taiwan by force. That was a year ago. It's now 5 years. So we hear that, but then we get a budget request from the Navy, which is generated out of the budget proposal from the president. Like, it doesn't match the sense of urgency.
So you're talking about a disconnect between the combatant commander and the service chief. Is that what we're talking about here?
All of the different processes, within the building, within the Pentagon, some of the constraints that exist, within Goldwater Nichols, the processes by which things are prioritized.
This is a huge problem with the growing threat.
Definitely is. I've been very vocal about it over my 4 years here in Congress, and I know that I have colleagues who also have the same concerns and continue that messaging. And it's also broader than just the Navy, the Air Force. It's broader than DoD. Last time we talked a lot about this idea of integrated deterrence. And since our last conversation, I've been thinking a lot about that. My biggest sort of concern with it is integrated deterrence residing as a concept and a way to think about our national defense, but within DoD. But what's missing is who's the integrator? DoD has a role, but this is a whole of government issue. I mean, there's commerce, there's trade, there's agriculture, there's every department in the government has some aspect of, this integrated deterrence concept, and who's leading that? That is the part I don't feel that, it's been clearly articulated or that's been identified, at the highest level of government, other than the president himself, and who's managing that on his behalf to integrate all aspects of government.
My YouTube channel is not political, but it would be negligent to not note that as we're sitting here, you're fresh from the final January 6th special committee hearing. What are your initial thoughts about the efforts of that committee?
Going into this, I thought, this is absolutely essential that we lay out the facts of what led up to January 6th, what happened on that day, and who was responsible. Our first attempt was to create a nonpartisan commission, just like the 9/11 Commission, completely independent, nonpartisan, outside of Congress. We passed that in the House. 35 Republicans in the House supported that, and then when it went to the Senate, they were unable to get enough votes, enough Republican votes to get to the 60-vote threshold. So, with that not moving forward, it was essential that we use whatever means necessary in order to conduct a thorough investigation of January 6th. The Select Committee was set up in the House. I have been humbled to be part of that, which has turned out to be a massive investigation. We've talked to over 1,000 witnesses, tens of thousands of documents, and as you know, over the last 18 months or so, we have really dug into.
So was it more work than you thought going in? Or did you know it was going to be this level of effort?
I anticipated it was going to be huge. We were going to be constrained by time and resources and what our capabilities were as a congressional committee. There are limitations on what we could do. As you saw, there are certain witnesses who just decided to defy subpoenas and not come before the committee. We have a certain purpose as a legislative committee within Congress. It's to provide recommendations, which are being released in the report that will come out today, and more information throughout this week. And really, my goal and thought going into this is we have to be able to prevent something like this from happening in the future. And so I think that the oversight, the legislative recommendations, the laying out of the facts as a basis for that material is really been very important to highlight for the American public everything that happened before and leading up to and on that day. And I think before we started our hearings, before we went through this series of what has been 10 hearings, people had gotten little snippets here and there, but there maybe people who haven't paid a lot of attention directly to this issue didn't have all the pieces to fit together. So I think in a lot of feedback I've gotten from people in my district have said, really, wow, I didn't realize all of this, once they have all the pieces of the puzzle, put them all together and can kind of see a clear picture. I think that clear picture came together today. I closed out the hearing today. I was the final person to make a motion. And it was to refer our report to the House, but that includes our recommendations as well as a criminal referral to the Department of Justice for Donald J. Trump and others, as we lay out in our report. I think something that's striking, when you can go back and read the executive summary of the report, it lists the witnesses that testified at our hearings. 99.9% Republican witnesses who served in some capacity, either in the Trump administration or federal or local, state, local government. Those are the very people who Trump appointed to serve in his government in some cases, or were elected in various capacities. And they had the courage to come forward and also say, this is wrong. And there are a select few who have refused to do that. Some of those have been referred for contempt of Congress charges for, failing to follow subpoenas. And the Department of Justice at this point, has multiple investigations that are going as well. I likened it to a relay where you're passing the baton. When you pass the baton in a relay, the person who's receiving the baton, they're already running too. So that's how I see this, as this Congress comes to an end, this committee is issuing its report, that the Department of Justice should find the information we gathered in our investigations useful and meaningful in what they're doing and continue to run.
You mentioned duty, something very strong to you. Have walked the walk with respect to duty as a Naval Academy graduate, as a career naval officer. So when you were given this, it wasn't an order, but you were given this charge by House leadership, did the duty thing kind of kick in? And so like sort of consequences be damned, this in your heart struck you as something that was in keeping with your conception of your duty as a lawmaker?
It definitely did, and you as a Naval Academy grad as well. I mean, I think back to the first time I took the oath of office as 17-year-old going in to be a plebe at the Naval Academy. But all the times that I've taken over the course of my career in the military, promotion, and then again now serving 2 terms in Congress, that that oath is to the Constitution. That oath is not to an individual. And I think that is really the most important key aspect of our government, that peaceful transition of power. And what we saw on January 6th, what we saw at the end of the Trump presidency, doesn't represent our country, our democracy, our values. And being part of this investigation, like I said, it's humbling to be part of something so important and so big, to put that information out there for the public, so people know the facts and people can be held accountable who are responsible for what happened.
So you knew this was going to be a tight race. To what degree do you think your involvement in the J6 committee affected the outcome of that election?
I think it had an effect. I went into it knowing, this is not going to be popular with everyone. And I do think, especially in our current environment, people were more firmly entrenched in where they were. The people who were supportive of my work on that committee were very supportive. In fact, it was really the main thing I heard for months, if not a year, when I was out in public and meeting with people. People would come up to me and say, "Thank you for the work you're doing on that committee. Thank you for protecting our democracy." And I get these letters in the mail every week, fellow Naval Academy grad, fellow retired naval officer, my father was a chief in the Navy, all these kind of things with ties to service, people saying it's so important. You, as a veteran serving on this committee, you represent my values, the writer of the letter, and thank you for doing this. But people who are in that camp who want to say he did nothing wrong or make excuses or just turn their head the other way about what was one of the most serious attempts to overthrow our government and our democratic institutions, those people, they weren't particularly pleased with my service on this committee. So the combination of the new district lines, 40% of the district being new, and the serving on the committee, I'm not going to be coming back to Congress next term, but I certainly know that the work I've done here is much more important than whether, Elaine Luria continues to serve in Congress, because I will continue in some capacity in public service. But I did know that going into it, that it was more about the work I was doing on the committee and the ultimate outcome than whether I personally got reelected.
So no bitterness, no...
Not at all.
The office is sort of empty compared to the last time we were here.
Right.
You're already kind of on the way out.
Ship and aircraft pictures
Yes,
are
all of
gone.
the good,
Yeah.
I love me well stuff is gone. So you mentioned there are other things to come. Can you give us an idea of what is next for Elaine Luria?
I think in Congress I've worked on a few issue areas that are very important to me, to our national defense, to the area that I live in and have called home for 2 decades, that being Hampton Roads. So the Navy. I want to continue the work I've done. I think I'm advocating for building and having the resources to build and shape the most effective Navy for the future. Other work that I've done and been a leader on is advanced nuclear power. As a Navy nuke myself, but kind of understanding the challenges we face with energy in the future. There's a lot of emphasis on wind and solar. When I came to Congress, there wasn't a single Democrat really talking about nuclear power, and I introduced legislation while I was in Congress working with Senator Murkowski, bipartisan, bicameral Nuclear Energy Leadership Act. We've been able to fund 2 test reactor demonstration projects over the course of several years, and now have really worked on significant legislation to try to ensure the security, viability of our fuel supply chain and enrichment capabilities within the U.S. So, really the nuclear sector is something I'm very enthusiastic about, and I think that, also moving forward, my experiences on this committee and really the important role I think we have in protecting democratic institutions, that's something that we want to make sure that I'm still a voice within that conversation.
And that'll do it for this episode. My thanks to Representative Luria for her invitation to attend the final J6 hearing and for sitting down to offer some final thoughts as she finishes her second term as a representative from Virginia. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.